My name is Charlotte, and I grew up in the shadow of my older sister, Sunday, as if covered by a thick canopy of her fame. Our house, like a bubbling hive, was always full of people, guests, friends, neighbors, and distant relatives, whom our parents received with a constant smile and warm hospitality. Sunday was a star, alive, bright, sparkling, as if the sunlight was reflected in her golden hair. Everything in our house seemed to revolve around her voice, around her relaxed confidence, the mesmerizing ease with which she played her role as the brilliant hostess of family holidays. I often think of our summer evenings when the grill was sizzling in the garden, enveloped in the aromas of freshly mown grass and flowers, and my father patiently turned over meat thickly sprinkled with spices and love. The smell of charcoal mixed with the spicy aromas of meat filled the air, penetrating into every corner of the courtyard. On the green lawn, perfectly aligned and neat, stood an old oak tree with branches that seemed to stretch out to protect us, to create an improvised outdoor stage for us. Mom, always active and caring, fluttered around, making sure that everyone had a drink in their hands, so that everyone was happy, and smiles shone on the faces of the guests. And in this serene, almost theatrical chaos, there always came a moment when Sunday was asked to perform her favorite song. She was encouraged, called to an improvised stage, and, with a slight coquetry and genuine joy, she climbed onto a chair as if it were her usual place. "Sing us something, Sunday," our Aunt Cheryl shouted over all the conversations. The eyes of all the adults glittered in anticipation, and Sunday pretended with an artful manner that it was something completely insignificant, but there was a sparkle in her gaze. With her slight cough, with a sly smile that made everyone cling to her face, she began to sing. How she loved performing Celine Dion songs, especially "My Heart Will Go On." She seemed to put her soul into every note, and the adults, succumbing to her charm, applauded and laughed, as if she were singing on stage in a large concert hall. Mom and Dad looked at her with such pride that even her father sometimes had tears glistening in the corners of his eyes. And I stood aside, hiding in the shade of the bushes, sinking into their green branches, as if into my own shell, into a small corner of safety where I could watch and listen from afar. It didn't mean that I didn't want to be a part of the celebration, that I didn't want to join in the joy and laughter. But every time I tried to sing, the sound came out choppy, awkward, like the voice of a kitten stuck in the branches of a tree. The words seemed to run away from me, like sunbeams that had just caught my eye and immediately disappeared. I stumbled on every line, my cheeks flushed bright red, and I hurried to hide even further away, where I could not be heard. Sometimes I would hear our relatives gathered on the sidelines, whispering about how different I was from my sister. I caught their glances, these unsolicited judgments, and although they tried to be tactful, it became clear to me that everyone knew who the real star in our family was. For Sunday, there were dance lessons, vocal classes, art workshops. She was always busy with something, all the time on the move, absorbed in her improvement, and I remained behind the scenes, left to myself. I didn't mind, I didn't feel left out. On the contrary, I found comfort and peace in solitude, and in peace and quiet I felt truly free. My world stretched out on the bookshelves in our house, dusty volumes, friends who were always waiting for me to open them, immerse myself in their pages. They revealed to me the worlds hidden in words, transported me to other continents and other times, where I was not Charlotte, Sunday's sister, but someone new, someone free from all expectations and comparisons. There was only one soul who seemed to really see me, who understood the very part that was hidden behind the exterior. My great-aunt Teresa always found me wherever I was hiding, whether it was behind the garage or in the tree house. Her eyes were full of that warm, sincere kindness that enveloped me like a soft blanket on a cold evening. She would sit next to me and, looking at me with interest, would always ask with a slight smile, "What adventure did you participate in today, Charlotte?" I looked up from the book, I'm always glad that someone wants to know about my world. Oh, just reading about ancient Egypt, would respond enthusiastically, showing her the cover of my latest book. Teresa, pursing her lips with approval, nodded, and in her eyes shone the unchanging kindness. You have a good head on your shoulders, girl, she said, pronouncing these words as if she were putting into them all her wisdom accumulated over the years. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Those moments with Teresa, her calm, almost invisible understanding, were like drops of balm on a wounded heart for me. She made me feel real. I didn't have to pretend to be a star or entertain anyone. She accepted me for who I was, and I didn't need to be anyone else. After that evening, everything changed. The moment I heard laughter tearing my dream to pieces, when I saw my mother's face, which for a moment reflected something like regret, but was immediately replaced by determination, which did not even give hope a chance, something inside me broke. Or, perhaps, on the contrary, for the first time in my life it fell into place. For the next few months, it was like I was living on automatic. Lessons and textbooks, books, educational materials, all this filled my every day. I left for school before everyone else and returned home last, barely allowing myself even a snack. My zeal became frantic, like a man who has undertaken to conquer a mountain, despite the bad weather, despite fatigue, despite the lack of equipment. There was an unshakable determination burning in the depths of my soul. I no longer needed their approval. I was no longer looking for compliments and gifts, but I still wanted to prove, first of all to myself, that I was capable of something more. Sunday's plans continued to occupy our house. Mom and Dad were still discussing her creative projects, accompanying every detail with admiring comments. In their eyes, the future was already a foregone conclusion. Sunday was waiting for a career, success, fame, all that they themselves had once dreamed of, as if they had inherited their ambitions and dreams from the only daughter they considered worthy. I attended these family gatherings, where my existence seemed barely noticed, and learned to maintain an outward calm, while rage accumulated inside me, turning into cold determination. Every evening, locked in my room, I carefully thought out a plan. I was no longer satisfied with the role of a quiet, forgotten girl, whose fate no one would pay attention to. I turned to my school mentor, Mr. Thompson, a strict but fair man who always appreciated my work and interest in learning. He was the first adult who saw potential in me, and not only made it clear to me, but also offered to help. I gathered all my academic papers and essays, putting my whole soul into them, and then showed him. Mr. Thompson studied them carefully and finally said, "You, Charlotte, are the most determined student I've seen in all my years of teaching. Don't stop." He helped me apply for several scholarships without saying a word to my parents. I collected all my achievements, exam results, and school projects and sent them to the admissions offices of the best educational institutions where I could find access. I spent these evenings at my desk, by the light of a small table lamp, exploring possibilities I hadn't known about before. Libraries and archives became my refuge, where I spent hours searching for information about programs, grants, scholarships, about everything that could be my chance to live independently. I became almost invisible to the family. They were so engrossed in preparing Sunday for graduation and college that my absence didn't bother them. Sometimes it seemed to me that they were even glad that I stopped asking my questions, did not stand aside, did not expect another disappointment. But I no longer needed their attention. I was already on my way. One day in late spring, I was sitting on a bench in the schoolyard, engrossed in another textbook, when a letter came from the college of my dreams. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding wildly as I opened the envelope and read the cherished lines, "Scholarship granted." It was a confirmation not only of my perseverance, but also of my faith in myself, the faith that had hardened under the weight of neglect and misunderstanding. The scholarship covered almost everything I needed, and there was only one thought left: cold and sober, I managed on my own. That evening, I returned home a little later than usual. When I walked in, Sunday, Mom and Dad were still discussing her latest successes. I stood in the doorway, watching them. They were laughing without noticing me. This moment seemed to last forever. With a light sigh, I walked past, up the stairs to my room, where a letter lay on the table, which now seemed to be the most precious thing I had. That night I stared at the stars for a long time through the window of my room. There, beyond the window, lay a world that I could finally call my own, and in front of me was a path created not by fame, attention, or gifts, but by my own effort. The world I was immersed in seemed completely different from everything I knew. University buildings sprawled across green lawns, lecture halls filled with the hum of hundreds of voices, and libraries overflowing with old-time, smelling tomes and computers with bright screens. All this beckoned and took your breath away. I felt like I was on another continent, so far from home and its tense atmosphere. And although I was still just Charlotte, here, unnoticed by the rest of the world, here, among other students striving for knowledge, my restraint did not look like a disadvantage. On the contrary, she helped me focus, go deeper, without wasting myself on the little things that my parents always paid so much attention to. The first semester was not easy for me. The level of requirements was amazing, and some subjects made me feel like I was a freshman at school again, barely understanding the material. But I knew that I had a power that I might not have realized before. Every morning I woke up earlier than others, spent hours in the library preparing for seminars, and took on more than the program offered. If as a child I used to hide from the bright light under the shadow of Sunday, then here, among students, teachers, and many opportunities, I felt that I could afford to go out into the light. There were, of course, difficult moments. Sometimes I had to hear other students talking about their parents, who paid for their education, visited them every Sunday, or sent caring packages. At such moments, I was overwhelmed by sadness, a reminder that my parents, absorbed in Sandy's career, never realized how much I could have achieved on my own. But whenever I felt lonely, I remembered Aunt Teresa and her kind eyes, her unwavering confidence that I deserved this chance. One day in October, when the bright leaves were already beginning to fall, I received a letter from her. Teresa was not one of those who wrote often, and her every response was all the more valuable. She described how she was gardening, mentioned that the neighbors were asking about that quiet girl who spent so much time at her house, and that she still thinks that somewhere in the house, behind the bookcase, she finds forgotten books left by me. At the end of the letter there was a phrase that sounded especially significant at that moment: "You are my light, Charlotte. Live this life and breathe it. She's yours now." With those words, something clicked inside me like a key in a lock. For the first time, I felt not only gratitude to Aunt Teresa, but also responsibility for her faith in me. It became my second wind. I started looking for internships and moonlighting at the university, deciding not to depend on her money for longer than necessary. My efforts did not go unnoticed. In the middle of the semester, Professor Samuelson, a lecturer in the management course, drew attention to my coursework. He invited me to join his research project on organizational strategies, and although I doubted, of course, whether I could handle such a responsibility, I did not refuse his offer. The project required effort, attention, and time, but at the same time it was a new, exciting experience. I absorbed knowledge like a sponge, rejoicing at every minute when I could plunge into theory and practice, when the same enthusiastic students were sitting next to me and the professor himself was mentoring. We spent hours discussing optimization methods and structural changes in organizations, and I discovered in myself not just a desire for success, but a real interest that made me delve deeper, ask questions, and look for answers. Every day I felt more confident, as if this journey, so long and full of doubts, had finally led me to where I needed to go. The winter holidays came, and the university was empty, immersed in a frosty calm. Unlike many students going home, I stayed on campus. There was no question of returning home. The tension in our family was still there, and I knew that my parents needed time to realize my changes, if they ever realized it at all. Instead, I wrote to Aunt Teresa, sharing my successes with her, and became more and more immersed in my studies and work on Professor Samuelson's project, deciding that I would devote the winter to self-development and preparation for the next semester. The coming January brought with it not only cold nights, but also new challenges. Aunt Teresa eagerly immersed herself in the world of digital technology. Every day she discovered something new for herself, sharing it with me with genuine joy. We began to talk much more often, now not only on the phone, but also in video chats, where her laughter sounded more lively and her face shone with warmth, even through the screen. She was happy to show me how her garden changed from season to season, showing off her blooming roses and fragrant herbs. There was real pride and satisfaction in her voice, and in those moments I realized that this smartphone had become not just a device for her, but a whole new window into the world. One day she called me with unusual excitement and, smiling almost shyly, told me that her video with an apple pie recipe had garnered several thousand views. Are people really interested in this? There was an ironic note in her voice. Apparently, everyone wants to learn how to bake a pie like yours, I replied with a smile, and she laughed, blushing slightly, but clearly flattered. Soon we noticed that her audience began to grow. People from different cities and even countries left comments admiring her pies and garden, asked for tips on growing plants, wrote how they cooked a pie for their family according to her recipe. Over time, her humble channel turned into a cozy virtual community. I was amazed by her lightness and sincerity. She remained herself, telling stories about how she grew her favorite daisies, or how a neighbor's cat named Murchik chose her flowering bushes for recreation. Meanwhile, my own life seemed to be gaining momentum. The position of a manager at Gilded Fork opened up new prospects for me, and I completely devoted myself to my work. I learned to understand the smallest nuances of the restaurant business, from working with suppliers to personnel management, and soon became not just a manager, but an indispensable part of the team. My colleagues, who at first saw me only as a newcomer, gradually began to turn to me for advice. My calmness and perseverance, which were once considered disadvantages, were now perceived as advantages, and my view of management became noticeable to management. I was even invited to speak at a professional conference for young managers, and although I was nervous, I knew I had to do it. I prepared a speech, which then turned out to be successful, and this was another important step for me. Several months passed, and one day, when I returned home after a long day at work, I found a message from Aunt Teresa. She sent me a short video with admiring reviews from her subscribers and wrote, "Charlotte, thanks to you, I felt really needed. Thank you, dear." Tears of joy welled up in my eyes. I felt that not only had I done something important for her, but she, with her care and faith, had invested in me the strength that allowed me to achieve everything that I had now. Over time, I began to notice more and more how both my life and Aunt Teresa's life seemed to merge into a single melody of mutual understanding that we both played. She found new hobbies for herself, and I saw a light shine in her life that she had once lit in me. Now, every time I went to my parents for dinner, the atmosphere in the house was much warmer than it used to be. We were no longer restrained or wary like in the past. Now, instead of icy silence and reproachful glances, there was a slight animation in the air, and conversations flowed easily like a warm river. Sandy was happy to talk about her new experience at work, shared her success in the restaurant with her parents, and I listened attentively, noticing how her voice gained confidence and calmness that it had not had before. Each of our meetings now resembled something more than just a lunch together. It was a kind of ritual for the revival of the family that we had once almost lost. The time I spent with my little niece was a special pleasure for me. She was an intelligent and inquisitive girl, asked dozens of questions about everything around her, and loved to listen to stories about the restaurant. I told her about different dishes, about how important it is to be able to work in a team, and she listened with her eyes wide open, as if these stories opened up a whole world to her. But deep down, I felt that everything had changed, not only for me, but also for my parents. They had to reconsider their ideas, views, and, perhaps for the first time, they began to realize my merits and efforts. Now they saw in me not just a daughter who they once did not consider worthy of their recognition, but a strong, independent woman whose success became a source of pride for them. Nevertheless, it would be naive to think that everything left behind has been forgotten and erased. Sometimes that old reproach flashed in his father's gaze, like a slight shadow passing over his face when he recalled past mistakes. He didn't know how to ask for forgiveness directly, and I understood that. But his actions spoke for him. For example, when he tried to surprise me by cooking my favorite dish for dinner, or when he unexpectedly bought me a concert ticket, knowing how much I adore music. With each new day, I felt that we were all learning to be close, gradually building bridges that we had destroyed before, building our family anew, layer by layer. Every visit to my parents was another brick in our house, and this time I knew that it would stand firm. Meanwhile, the work continued to require my full attention. The expansion of the restaurant chain has become a real challenge, but at the same time a huge opportunity for growth. I met with interior designers, tasted dishes with chefs, made decisions on which not only my career depended, but also the success of the whole enterprise. It was the life I had always dreamed of, but it turned out to be much more difficult and exciting than I could have imagined. And every new day I found moments to write to Aunt Teresa or leave a comment under her next video. She became more and more interested in her blog, and even created a separate column in which she talked about her life, how she spends her days in the garden, about funny cases with the neighbor's cat and her baking tips. Her voice was now audible not only to me, but also to hundreds of subscribers who followed her stories and left warm comments, sincerely rejoicing for her. Life, as I knew it, has found a new harmony. After a long time filled with sleepless reflections and emotions, I still came to the conclusion that this betrayal was something inevitable. As much as I would like to think that all the efforts put into rebuilding the family were worth it, but the cold, searing reality reminded me that their recognition and respect for me were, in fact, empty words. They were building an illusion, which, as I understood it, served only their interests and convenience, and not my recognition. I woke up in the morning with a feeling of strange, unfamiliar relief. The emptiness of the pain was still felt, but now it was as if at a distance, as if something painful had finally gone away. With the clarity and determination that came to me overnight, I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and wrote a letter for Mr. Brandon, my boss. In it, I explained that I would no longer be able to answer for the financial needs of my parents, that their participation in the life of the restaurant was no longer part of my circle of concerns. It was important for me to inform him about this, because he always supported me, and now he had to understand that the moment had come to dot all the I's in my personal affairs. The letter was restrained, almost cold, but when I finished, I felt a surge of strange pride. This moment meant that, despite all the pain, I was finally completely free from their manipulations. It was several days before I met Sunday again. She came to my restaurant, smiling shyly, as if realizing that the conversation was going to be difficult. We sat down at a far table where no one could hear us, and she spoke cautiously. "Charlotte, I do not know how to explain this. I don't support what they said, and I'm sorry that I didn't say anything at the time. I was just so confused, I didn't know what to do." Her voice was trembling, and I could see that this remorse was not fake. "You know, Sunday, I replied, looking at her seriously. I'm sorry you felt like that. But life is a choice. And sometimes it is important not only not to be for, but also to be against. When it comes to injustice, the words themselves formed into a quiet but decisive confession. Sunday nodded, and realization flashed in her eyes. She realized that perhaps her delay had cost us the friendship we could have restored. She apologized again, but I knew the wound went deeper than a simple apology. I wanted to forgive her, but part of me knew that regaining trust was a long way to go. As time went on, I became more and more immersed in my work. Mr. Brandon kept his word. The new project was developing at an incredible speed. I spent days and nights dealing with documents, meeting with suppliers, coordinating all the details of the future interior with the designer. I found peace and solace in this activity. One evening, as I sat at my desk, among the blueprints and contracts, and looked at the intricate schemes of the new restaurant, it suddenly dawned on me, finally, my life belonged only to me. But one evening I got a text from Aunt Teresa. She wanted to know how I was feeling after all the recent events, and added that she supported me in my decision. She offered to meet and spend the weekend together. Her care and unwavering devotion warmed my heart. She remained the person who was always on my side, always ready to support and protect. Soon, when I came to her, she greeted me with such joy and warmth that I understood. I have a family, even if it's not what I once imagined. Walking home that evening, I walked slowly, as if I was afraid that moving too fast would ruin the magic of the moment. There was something special in the air, the sweet scent of blooming lilacs from the neighbors' flower beds, a light breeze, the rustle of leaves, and it all seemed like part of a new beginning. I finally stopped clinging to old wounds and found the strength to become the person I always wanted to be. That night I lay in silence, listening to the measured ticking of the clock on the wall. I remembered the path I had traveled, how it all started, and how the pain and frustration that seemed endless had brought me to this moment. Memories came flooding back. The first steps in my career, doubts, meetings with Mr. Brandon, his trust in me and his belief that I would cope. I rolled over on my side and closed my eyes, feeling a smile touch my lips. This position, this chance, it was all the result of my own work, my nights spent writing reports and plans, my desire to become something more than just a girl who was once neglected and underestimated. The next day, I felt the need to celebrate all this, not with any of my colleagues or friends, but with those who were really there, no matter what. I decided to invite Aunt Teresa to lunch at a small, cozy restaurant known for its simple but surprisingly delicious dishes. We chose a table by the window, and while the waiter brought us hot plates with fragrant pasta and glasses of wine, I shared with her the news about the appointment. Her eyes filled with pride, and she said softly, "Charlotte, you've always been the kind of person who couldn't be overlooked, even if many couldn't see it right away. You are not just a talent, but also a heart that has always strived to do everything according to its conscience, and this is what sets you apart from others." Her words hit me deeper than I could express. I knew that these words were sincere, and they will always remain in me. We sat for a long time, discussing plans for the future, dreaming and laughing, while the light of the sun softly flickered in the windows of the restaurant, leaving us in the cozy evening shade. However, despite this joy, there was a vague shadow somewhere inside, a feeling that the story with the parents was not over yet. As much as I wanted to let go of the past, it dragged after me, in the form of messages and calls that I didn't answer. Recently, I learned from a mutual friend that they had serious financial problems, that the house needed renovation again, and that they could barely cope without my support. One weekend, while I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, Aunt Teresa sent me a short message. Sometimes we have to let go of the past in order to create a new one. These words stayed in front of my eyes for a long time. They sounded in my heart as a reminder that forgiveness is not necessarily a return to what it was, but an opportunity to give yourself freedom. Slowly but surely, I realized that it was time to talk to Sunday. We had both avoided this topic for months, but now, after life had put me back on the path to finding myself, I felt I could complete it, leaving the bitterness behind. The next day after work, when the restaurant was silent, I called Sunday to my office. She came in, visibly nervous, and we sat down opposite each other, separated not only by the table, but also by a whole layer of unspoken words.